Hello, and welcome to Fieldfisher's Get Data Protection Fit series for 2023. My name is Kate Partridge, and I'm a director in our data team, and I'm joined today by Associate Charley Guile and Solicitor Gabbie Leszko. This Get Data Protection Fit series will focus on a program of bite-sized training for lawyers and privacy professionals. For those of you who have joined in for our previous Get Fit programs, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to the series, we hope you find these useful in the ever-changing privacy landscape. In this series, our topics will focus on international data transfers, starting today with EU standard contractual clauses and moving on to UK international data transfer agreements in February, TIAs in March, BCRs in April, and then the UK's Data Reform Bill in May. The team here at Fieldfisher hope that by the end of this session, you should be better able to explain the 4 EU SCC modules, how to complete the EU SCC modules, the UK addendum, key obligations when entering into the EU SCCs, and now that the EU SCC repapering deadline has passed, what we might expect next. I now hand you over to Gabbie, who will begin by explaining the EU SCC modular structure.
Thank you, Kate. As you mentioned, the EU SCCs have 4 different modules and therefore cater for 4 types of possible arrangements between data controllers and data processors. The 4 different modules can be seen on the slide. Modules 1 and 2 were already covered by the old SCCs, but Module 3, Processor to Processor, and 4, Processor to Controller, are new additions. Module 4 is a slightly unusual addition in that it contains clauses specifically for situations where a processor is subject to the EU GDPR and it transfers data to a controller in a third country who is not subject to the EU GDPR. If required, parties can choose more than one module depending on their relationship. You will see on the right-hand side of the slide that the SCCs are divided into 4 sections. Section 1 deals with general introductory provisions such as the purpose of the SCCs and the docking clause. Section 2 deals with data protection safeguards, liability and supervision provisions, and in cases of modules 2 and 3 fulfills all of the requirements of Article 28, negating the need for a separate data processing agreement. Section 3 deals with the effect of local law and practices on the SCCs, as well as obligations in cases of access by public authorities. The final section explains what happens if the parties do not comply with the SCCs, and also clarifies the choice of forum and jurisdiction. You will also note from the slide that only sections 2 to 4 are modular, while section 1 applies to all modules. In addition to the main text, the SCCs also contain 3 annexes, which we will cover on the next slide. In order to be valid, the SCCs need to be completed correctly. It is essential for parties to get their SCCs right, and this stage is often overlooked. On this slide, I will talk you through the optional clauses and annexes, which you will need to address in the new EU SCCs. The first optional clause you will come across is the docking clause, and this may be applied or disapplied by the parties. If the docking clause is applied, it allows additional parties to join the contract in the future. This can be helpful where the entities involved in the processing of data change throughout the lifecycle of a contract, such as the inclusion of an additional sub-processor. The second optional clause you will see is the appointment of sub-processor clause, and as you can see, this applies to modules 2 and 3 only. Under this clause, parties have to choose from one of 2 options, either prior specific authorization or general written authorization. For both options, the processor must provide the controller with a list of all sub-processors, and this must be their specific names and not just the category. In the case of prior specific authorization, the processor will need to submit a request to engage any sub-processor as well as completing Annex 3. Under general authorization, a pre-approved list is agreed between the parties, and the controller must be informed of any changes to that list. The time period for submitting a request to engage a new sub-processor or to make changes to a pre-approved list is for the parties to negotiate. Often, what we see in practice is organizations linking this period to the time period they already have in their existing controller-to-processor appointments for consistency. The third optional clause is found in Clause 11 of the SCCs, and this is the redress clause. This requires data importers to provide data subjects with an easily accessible contact authorized to handle complaints relating to the SCCs. But there is also some additional optional language included here by which the data importer may also allow data subjects to lodge complaints to an independent dispute resolution body. In practice, we often see parties exclude this additional language. Finally, governing law, jurisdiction and competent authority. There is a requirement in the SCCs to enter the law which will govern them. Often what we see in practice is parties wanting to predetermine governing law and competent authority. However, strictly speaking, for modules 2 and 3, the SCCs specifically provide that the governing law will be the country where the data exporter is established. In respect of the competent authority, Clause 13 indicates how the competent authority should be selected. For example, where a data exporter is established in an EU member state, the supervisory authority responsible for that member state should act as the competent authority. As noted previously, in addition to the main text, the SCCs also contain 3 annexes. Annex 1 must be completed for every single module, and it deals with the details of processing, such as the list of parties, what data is being transferred, how frequently it is being transferred, the nature of processing, and so on. This must be completed accurately for each transfer taking place between the parties. Annex 2 deals with the security measures, and this is applicable to modules 1 to 3 only and not module 4. Annex 2 contains a list of examples of possible measures that can be put in place. The parties are not required to list each of these measures, but should describe those measures that are actually implemented by the data importer to ensure an appropriate level of security. This is significantly more detailed than under the previous EU SCCs, and we advise clients to engage security teams to assist with populating this annex. Finally, Annex 3 deals with sub-processors, and it is only relevant for modules 2 and 3 where specific authorization applies. Whilst it is not a requirement for general authorization, in practice we often see parties still choose to include an Annex 3 to act as the pre-approved list we mentioned earlier. I hope that this whistle-stop tour of how to complete the EU SCC's optional clauses and annexes has been helpful. I will now pass you on to Charley, who will talk to you about the UK addendum.
Thanks, Gabbie. Given Brexit, the UK has its own rules on transferring personal data outside of the UK to those non-adequate countries. The ICO recognises that many organisations carrying out data transfers will already have the EU SCCs in place. Therefore, one of the approaches under the UK data protection law allows organisations to enter into an addendum to the EU SCCs and rely on those for the transfers. The addendum itself means it's easier to maintain and negotiate one set of transfer mechanisms and avoids deal friction, as customers are likely to be more familiar with the EU SCCs. The addendum is short and simple, spanning just 9 pages, and while the contents being relied upon for the transfer is mainly contained within the EU SCCs, Part 2 of the addendum sets out some amendments required to make those EU SCCs work for UK purposes. For example, amending the references to laws or jurisdictions to refer to the UK. Part 1 of the addendum is split into 4 tables, which require similar details to that contained in the annexes to the EU SCCs, which Gabbie just walked through. The tables are made up of the parties, so the importer and exporter, the relevant modules of the EU SCCs that the parties are going to rely upon and entering into, the optional clauses, which Gabbie was discussing, and specifically mentioning which optional elements of the EU SCCs are being relied upon, i.e., are you relying on general or specific authorization for the appointment of sub-processors, or whether the optional docking clause is being included. And then finally, the information and where that's contained for the appendices. As with the EU SCCs, the addendum can be incorporated by reference or annex to the main agreement, or entered into entirely separately. In all cases, the most important thing is to ensure that the relevant detail of the tables have been clearly completed. This is essential for the parties to get the UK addendum right and ensure they have the detail to be sufficiently relied upon. For example, if you're incorporating by reference, you need to ensure it's made clear which options and what information is relevant for completion of those tables. We often see parties cross-referring to the EU SCCs for details for this purpose. For example, tables 1 to 3 of the addendum will be completed with the details set out in clause X above. So you follow the steps in the presentation and how to complete the SCCs and the addendum, sign them, and you can forget about them, right? Well, wrong. One of the big concerns with the old SCCs was that organisations signed them and failed to understand what they were signing up to, and they were shoved in the back of the theoretical drawer. The new SCCs prescribe ongoing obligations that you need to comply with to avoid being in breach of the SCCs and therefore not having a transfer mechanism in place. Some of these are obligations you'd expect as a result of Article 28, and others go beyond this to deal with SREMs. Whilst the slide and presentation does not take away the need for organisations to review the provisions of the SCCs, on this slide we're highlighting some of the more onerous obligations you should be aware of. So firstly, under the SCCs, you need to keep certain documents and records in place to prove your compliance with the clauses and specific obligations, including, for example, government access requests, some of which may need to be available to the supervisory authority on request. Next up, if you're a processor, you need to flow down terms to your sub-processors, noting that the SCCs require these to be the same data protection provisions, not just similar. Whilst this may seem quite onerous, this is the same requirement as you would find in Article 28. Next up, whilst not a new requirement, it is important to be aware that data subjects may request to receive a copy of the SCCs entered into with the processors and sub-processors. This is often triggered by the subject being aware of their rights or this being referenced to in a privacy notice. Where acting as a processor, the exporter may request copies of any sub-processor agreements. So for both points 3 and 4, while certain details may be redacted, you should have processes in place so you can deal with such requests and action them when required. Next up, the SCCs require parties to warrant that they have no reason to believe that the laws of a third country will prevent the data importer complying with the clauses. And as part of this warranty, the parties are expected to have carried out that transfer impact assessment and have this documented, noting that this could be requested again by the supervisory authority for review. And finally, processors need to inform the exporter or controller of any government access request. So again, having set out policies in place to deal with such requests will help out organisations to comply with this.
Thank you, Charlie. So, now that we have a better understanding of what the 4 EU SCC modules are, how to complete them, how to use the UK addendum, and what it means to sign up to these clauses, are we all done and dusted here? Well, maybe. Many of you may be aware that the 27th of December 2022 deadline for repapering has now passed. So, most organisations will have updated many of their existing EU SCCs by now. But no doubt we will all find a few skeletons in the closet as contracts come up for renewal or where organisations have taken a risk-based approach in terms of their repapering projects. It's also possible that the passing of this deadline, we might see an uptick in regulator and activist group investigations. The CNIL, the French data protection regulator, issued a reminder in December last year about the EU SCC deadline. At this stage, it's still very much watch this space. But as a suggestion, we would recommend updating any external-facing documents, such as your privacy notices, to reference any updated SCCs. Of note, the EU SCCs should not in fact be used for transfers where the non-EU entity is already subject to the GDPR because of its extraterritorial reach. The EU SCCs were in fact designed for importers not subject to the GDPR. So at this stage, many organisations are left with no choice other than to use the EU SCCs in their current form, as there's no better alternative. However, the EDPB's Q&As have again made it clear that the European Commission is in the process of developing an additional set of SCCs for this scenario. So another one for us to watch. In terms of a review in 2024, the GDPR requires a review of that legislation every 4 years. The next review is expected by 2024, and it will also include an evaluation of the practical application of the SCCs. I wouldn't expect this to mean any actual changes in practice to the new EU SCCs, but more likely to highlight any practical challenges organisations face in implementing them, or it may contain recommendations for improvements going forward. This brings us to the end of today's presentation. By the end of this session, you should be able to better explain the 4 EU SCC modules, how to complete the EU SCC modules, the UK addendum, key obligations when entering into the EU SCCs, and now that the EU SCC repapering deadline has passed, what we might expect next. If you're interested in learning more about data and privacy, our data team launched our YouTube channel in 2020, and it hosts a variety of content for lawyers and privacy professionals. This includes the fundamentals of data protection law, subscriber Q&As, and mini-series, such as our current series on what you need to know in 20 minutes on international data transfers. We have some details on the slide on how you can join our YouTube channel and how you can receive our team's email digest and periodic updates. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you will join us next month for Fieldfisher's data team's presentation on the UK's International Data Transfer Agreement, what you need to know in 20 minutes, and for the rest of our International Data Transfer series.